In June 1962, inside a cramped back room on Uxbridge Road in Hanwell, West London, a man named Jim Marshall plugged a guitar into a machine that had never existed before that moment, and the sound that came out did not just fill the room. It filled the next 60 years, 4,000 units a week, 350 workers, a sound behind Jimi Hendrix, a sound behind Pete Townshend, a sound behind every stage that mattered from London to Tokyo to Los Angeles, a name so embedded in the identity of music that bands who could not afford the product were buying empty cabinets just to be photographed near the logo. Then the founder died, and piece by piece the empire he built with his hands was taken apart by people who understood money far better than they understood sound. Chapter 1. The Sound That Built and Broke Empire. The room in Hanwell was small. The walls were thin. Ken Brand stood at the bench, his hands moving through the circuit with the steadiness of someone who had taken machines apart so many times that the logic lived in his fingers now, not his head. Dudley Craven, 17 years old, sat close and watched every connection. Jim Marshall stood back. He did not speak. He listened. The guitarist hit one chord. Nobody moved. The sound hung in the room like something physical. Not clean, not polite. It pushed. It pressed against the walls. It asked nothing and demanded everything. Then the guitarist lifted his hand off the strings, looked at the machine, and said, quietly, almost to himself, "Can we do that again?" Hi, viewers. Here is a question for you right now, and drop your answer in the comments below. If you spent 50 years building something from nothing, with your own hands, your own sacrifice, and your own name on the door, and someone offered you $500 million for it the moment you were gone, what do you think happens next? Comment below. Subscribe, so you do not miss the answer. Because what happened to Marshall Amplification after that deal will change the way you look at every brand name you have ever trusted. That single question was the beginning of a sound empire worth $500 million, and the end of it. Within 6 weeks, 15 musicians had placed orders. Within 3 months, the number was 40. No advertisement had been placed. No flyer had been printed. No salesman had made a single call. The sound had moved on its own from one rehearsal room to the next, from one guitarist to another, traveling through the London music circuit the way fire moves through the dry paper. Fast. Quiet at first. Then impossible to stop. Jim Marshall had not yet named the product. He had not yet set a price. He was already behind, and he had not yet begun. But the demand was not the danger. The danger was what the demand would eventually attract. Because 40 years after that first chord rang out in a back room in Hanwell, the building that bore Jim Marshall's name would be acquired by people who had never stood on a factory floor, never heard what made the name worth buying, and the $500 million they paid would not save the thing that made the name worth anything at all. The collapse did not begin with failure. It began at the moment of the greatest success. Chapter 2. A man who refused limits and logic. By every measure of what was supposed to be possible for a man like Jim Marshall, the back room in Hanwell should never have existed. The machine on that bench should never have been built. The sound it produced should never have reached anyone. He was born in 1923 in Southall, Middlesex. His father left early. His mother raised him alone with no money and no safety beneath them. Before he turned 15, tuberculosis moved into his bones and spent 3 years dismantling him from the inside out. He missed school the way other children miss a single afternoon, except he missed years of it. 8 weeks. That was the total of Jim Marshall's formal education. Not 8 months, not 8 semesters. 8 weeks across his entire childhood. No engineering degree, no technical training, no investor with a checkbook and a belief in the idea. What he had was a body that illness had rebuilt through sheer survival, an instinct sharpened by years of watching musicians work, and a refusal, quiet, absolute, and consistent to accept that the problem he could see did not have a solution. He taught himself to tap dance. He got good enough to perform professionally. He gave lessons. He saved money the way a man saves when there is no margin for error, carefully, without waste, with complete awareness of what losing it would mean. In 1960, at 37 years old, he opened a music shop on Uxbridge Road in Hanwell and began selling drums and giving lessons to anyone who walked through the door. Those musicians told him the same thing every week in different words. The amplifiers available in Britain in the early 1960s were wrong, not slightly wrong, structurally wrong. They were built for a version of music that was already ending for ballrooms and supper clubs, for restrained evening performances where volume was considered a matter of taste rather than necessity. They were not built for what was happening in the basements and church halls of London, where young guitarists were chasing a sound with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Jim Marshall did not nod politely and move on. He listened. He listened the way a man listens when he has found the problem he was built to solve. Ken Brann was already working in the shop. His understanding of circuit wiring was not theoretical. It was physical, built from repetition. From the accumulated knowledge of a man who had opened and rebuilt enough machines that the logic had stopped being thought and started being felt. Dudley Craven was 17 and possessed an instinct for component layout that no classroom had produced and no classroom could have produced. Jim Marshall brought these two men into the back room and told them what the musicians needed. Then he told them to build it. They started with a Fender Bassman, an American amplifier whose reputation had crossed the Atlantic before the units had. Marshall bought one, took it apart on the bench, and determined that it was a beginning and nothing more. The components available in Britain were different. The voltage standards were different. The cost of exact replication was not viable. So they changed it. First from necessity, then from preference. Then from a conviction that the changes they were making were not compromises. They were improvements. What emerged from that back room was not a copy of anything that existed before it. It was new. It was theirs. And the 40 orders that arrived before Marshall had settled on a name or a price were not a business metric. They were a verdict. But Jim Marshall was not thinking about verdicts. He was thinking about the next unit, about the standard, about the sound in his head that every completed machine had to match before it left the room. That standard was about to become the most valuable thing he owned, and the most dangerous. Chapter 3. One chord that changed music forever. The first Marshall amplifier did not announce itself. It sat on a bench in a back room in Hanwell black vinyl over wood, chrome knobs along the top panel, a speaker grill in a plain rectangular frame. Nothing about it looked like a turning point. Nothing about it suggested that the chord about to be played through it would set the direction of music for the next half-century. Then the guitarist plugged in. The sound that came out was not what British musicians had been given before. It did not stay inside itself. It pushed. It pressed against the upper limit of what the cabinet could hold, a warmth that thickened at higher volumes, a controlled edge that did not feel like a machine failing, but like a machine finally telling the truth. Like it had been holding something back and had stopped. The guitarist played one chord, lifted his hand, said nothing for a full moment, then asked to do it again. Within 6 weeks, 15 musicians had placed requests. Within 3 months, 40 orders had arrived, and not one of those 40 musicians had heard an advertisement, because there was no advertisement. The sound had traveled on its own, from one rehearsal room to the next, from one guitarist to the ear of another, moving through the London music circuit with a speed that no marketing budget could have produced. Jim Marshall had no pricing structure in place. He had no production system capable of handling 40 units. He had a back room, 2 collaborators, and a standard that he refused to lower regardless of how far behind demand the output fell. Ken Brann made the circuit decisions that produced the sound. The specific departures from the Bassman design, the component substitutions made from necessity, the layout choices made from instinct produced a tonal character that no one had planned and no one fully understood yet. Dudley Craven assembled with a precision that a formally trained engineer might have achieved differently and possibly worse. Jim Marshall held the standard. Every completed unit had to sound like the thing in his head. If it did not, It did not leave the room. The first significant validation came through Pete Townshend. He was not yet the figure he would become. He was a young guitarist in a band trying to find a sound that matched the force of what he was feeling when he played. He plugged into a Marshall and found it. He later described the distortion that emerged at high volume not as a side effect, but as the sound itself: honest, physical, irreplaceable. He said the Marshall was the only amplifier that distorted truthfully. That sentence would take years to reach the public. But the truth inside it was present from the first chord in the Hanwell room. The 40 orders were a beginning. They were also a warning, though no one in that back room was reading it that way. Because the demand that arrived without advertising, without a brand, without a name that anyone outside a small circle of London musicians recognized, was the kind of demand that eventually attracts a different kind of attention. Not from musicians, from people who look at 40 orders and see not a sound, but a number. Jim Marshall was not thinking about those people yet. He was thinking about the next unit, about the gap between what was in his head and what was on the bench. He would not think about those people until it was far too late to stop them. Chapter 4. When Amplifiers Became Symbols of Power. By 1965, Jim Marshall was no longer selling amplifiers. He did not fully understand this yet. The invoices still said amplifiers. The workers were still building amplifiers. The product that left the Milton Keynes facility and arrived on stages across Britain was, technically and legally, an amplifier. But that was not what it was anymore. It was a statement. When a Marshall stack appeared behind a performer on a British stage in 1965, it did not communicate a purchasing decision. It communicated intent. It told the audience before a single note was played, before the performer had opened their mouth or touched their instrument, that what was about to happen was not going to be quiet. That the person standing in front of those stacked cabinets had made a decision about the kind of force they intended to bring to the room. Jimi Hendrix arrived in London in September 1966. He came with a technique that no amplifier currently available could fully realize, a relationship between hand and string and electronic signal that required a machine willing to be pushed past its rated limits and respond with something other than failure. He needed a machine that would meet aggression with aggression, that would transform at the edge rather than simply stop. He tried the Marshall stack. He did not use anything else for the rest of his life. There was no sponsorship arrangement, no deal was made, no contract signed. Hendrix chose Marshall the way a craftsman chooses a tool, because it was the only one that could do what the work required. When he appeared at the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, 3 Marshall cabinets stacked behind him, the volume at the limit of what the equipment could sustain. The performance ending with the guitar burning on the stage, the image that photograph produced became permanent. The Marshall stack was not background, it was not set dressing, it was part of the argument Hendrix was making about what music could be when it was finally fully allowed to be itself. Pete Townshend was driving his Marshall units past their rated capacity as a matter of philosophy by 1966. Not by accident, not through carelessness. He was doing it deliberately, because what emerged from that edge, the controlled distortion, the harmonic complexity that clean signal could not produce, was the sound he had been looking for before he found the machine that could make it. He said the Marshall distorted truthfully. That phrase traveled. It reached musicians who had not yet heard the amplifier, and it made them need to. By the late 1960s, the Marshall stack had developed a visual grammar that functioned without sound. Bands who could not afford the units were purchasing empty cabinets for promotional photographs. The script logo, modeled on a handwriting style Jim Marshall had personally chosen, was recognizable from across a darkened venue in a black and white photograph. You did not need to read it. You knew what it meant. The product had become a symbol, and symbols, unlike products, cannot be quality controlled, cannot be tested by a technician with a guitar, cannot be walked past on a production floor by a founder who knows what the sound is supposed to be. Symbols belong to whoever holds the name. Jim Marshall did not know it yet, but the name he had built was now worth more than anything the factory could produce. And someone, somewhere, was beginning to understand exactly what that meant. Chapter 5. The Factory That Turned Craft into Legacy. The Milton Keynes facility had a sound of its own, not the sound of amplifiers being tested, though that was there too, rolling out of the testing room in overlapping waves of guitar tone that no musician had ever arranged, but that somehow belonged together, like a chord no one had written. The sound of the building itself was something different. It was the sound of a system running at full capacity. Of 350 people inside a space that had been built around a single, uncompromising objective. The wood mill ran first. Baltic birch fed through cutting machinery in long, clean passes, the smell sharp and dry, sawdust rising in the light that came through the upper windows. The cuts were precise, because they had always been precise. The workers in the wood mill did not measure against a tolerance document every time. They measured against memory, against 11 years of cuts that had been right, and the physical knowledge of what wrong felt like before it was finished. Moved toward the electronic section and the air changed. Solder flux, a faint sweetness underneath a metallic warmth that had been building since the morning shift began. The wiring benches were long and low and lit from above. The workers there moved with the economy of people whose hands had stopped waiting for instruction from their minds. The motion was not mechanical. It was practiced. There is a difference. Barbara Travers started in the hand wiring section in 1974, 8 months after giving birth to twins. She had worked in electronics assembly before, at a facility outside Coventry that had closed without warning and left its workers standing in a car park on a Tuesday morning with 2 weeks of pay and no explanation. She came to Marshall because the wage was steady and the building was 15 minutes from where she lived. She stayed for 11 years. She could wire a chassis to specification in under 4 minutes. She could feel a correctly completed circuit before she tested it, not as a figure of speech, but as a physical reality. In the resistance of the connections under her fingers, in the way a properly seated component differed from one that was close but not right. She had built that knowledge across 11 years of mornings. It lived in her hands now. It was not transferable by instruction. It could only be built by time. She was not exceptional among the Milton Keynes workforce. She was representative of it. The covering department smelled of contact adhesive chemical and immediate, the kind of smell that settles in the throat and stays there. The workers applying black vinyl Tolex to finished cabinets moved with a speed that looked careless to a visitor standing at the edge of the floor. It was not careless. The finished cabinets that came off that section had no imprecise edges, no unclean corners. The speed was the result of repetition so deep it had become a different kind of accuracy. Every completed amplifier was tested before it left the building. Not by a calibrated electronic rig. By a technician with a guitar in their hands, playing in real time, listening for the sound that the unit was supposed to produce. The quality standard was not a number on a meter. It was a sound. The technician knew what the sound was supposed to be. If the unit did not produce that sound, the unit did not pass. Jim Marshall walked the floor, not on a schedule, not on a monthly inspection designed to be visible and reassuring. He walked it the way a man moves through a space he built with his own decisions, stopping at a bench to listen, asking a question about a join that looked different from what he expected. Running his hand along a finished cabinet before it moved to testing, the workers knew he would appear. It changed how they worked. Not from fear, from the presence of someone whose standard was not abstract, whose standard was standing in the room with them. In 1984, Marshall expanded the facility. Jim Marshall made the investment and made the statement that accompanied it publicly, on record, in language that left no room for interpretation. This factory, these workers, this location, the product would be built here, always. He said it the way a man says something he has already decided can never be undone. He was wrong about that, because the decisions that would undo it were already being prepared. Not on the factory floor, not in the testing room, not anywhere that smelled of solder flux or Baltic birch or contact adhesive. In rooms where the only thing being measured was the number, and the number was $500 million. Chapter 6. The Illusion of Permanence Inside Success. Robert Elias showed up to work on a Monday morning in the winter of 1988 and did not think once about whether the job would still exist by Friday. That was not carelessness. That was the reality of working at Marshall Amplification in Milton Keynes at the height of its power. The work was there. The wage was there. The building was there. 350 people walked through those doors every morning with the same unspoken assumption that what they were walking into was permanent. That the thing they had helped build was too real, too specific, too deeply rooted in the ground beneath their feet to be moved or dissolved or converted into something unrecognizable. Robert had started in the wood mill in 1978. He was 23 years old. His father had worked manufacturing in Coventry and had told him once, without sentiment, that a job in a good factory was the closest thing to security an ordinary man could find. Robert had believed that. He had built his life around it. He had a wife, 2 children, a house 15 minutes from the facility, and a Saturday morning routine coaching youth football that depended on a Friday paycheck that had never once been late. He had worked at Marshall for 10 years before he fully understood what he was part of. The understanding came not from a number or a news report, but from a moment on the floor. A musician, a touring guitarist whose name Robert did not catch, had come through the facility on what the company described as a visit. The guitarist had walked the wood mill, walked the electronics section, walked the covering department, and said almost nothing. Then he stopped near the testing room, stood in the doorway, and listened for a long time to the overlapping guitar tones coming from inside. When he turned back, his eyes were different. He looked at Robert and said, "This is where it comes from. All of it. Right here." Robert went home that evening and told his wife what the man had said. She asked who the guitarist was. Robert said he did not know. She said it did not matter. Robert agreed. It did not matter because the point was already made. What was being built inside that facility was not a product. It was a source. Musicians came to it the way people traveled to a place that produced something that changed them not to purchase, but to understand the origin of the thing they had been carrying with them for years. The economic structure around the facility reflected its weight. 350 direct jobs generated a surrounding ecosystem that conservative estimates placed at twice that number. Suppliers, contractors, service businesses built entirely around the payroll of a single factory. The wages were not minimum. The technical roles, the wirers, the testers, the wood mill operators who had developed tolerances in their hands that no machine could replicate paid enough for a person to own a house in the town where they worked. To raise children. To plan a future that extended beyond the next month. That was not a small thing. In manufacturing communities across Britain in the 1980s, that kind of stability was becoming rare enough to be remarkable. Marshall provided it. Without ceremony, without announcement, without a single press release about its commitment to the community it had built. It provided it the way a well-constructed building provides shelter, not by making a promise, but by simply standing. Jim Marshall understood this. He walked that floor, and he knew what the wages meant to the people earning them. He knew what the jobs meant to the town. He had made the commitment in 1984, the expansion, the investment, the public statement that the factory would stay, and the product would be built here, not as a marketing gesture, but as a declaration of what he believed a company owed the people who made it real. What no one in Milton Keynes fully understood in 1988 was how completely that declaration depended on one man's ability to enforce it. And that one man was not going to be there forever. The building was full. The orders were coming. Robert Elias was coaching football on Saturday mornings and picking up a paycheck that had never once been late. The assumption of permanence had never felt more justified. That was the problem. Chapter 7. When a name becomes bigger than makers. There is a moment when a name stops belonging to the people who built it. It does not arrive with an announcement. It does not appear in a press release or a board meeting minute. It arrives the way all permanent changes arrive quietly, incrementally, and only fully visible in retrospect. When the distance between what something was and what it has become is too wide to pretend it is not there. By the late 1980s, the Marshall name had reached that threshold. It was everywhere. Not in the way that successful products are everywhere present in stores, available for purchase, familiar to buyers. It was everywhere the way a symbol is everywhere. Embedded in the visual language of music, of culture, of the idea of what it meant to perform with complete commitment to volume and force, and the willingness to be heard at any cost. The stacked cabinets appeared in the background of album covers that would go on to sell 50 million copies combined. They appeared in films. They appeared in stadium concerts broadcast to 47 countries simultaneously. They appeared in Spinal Tap, and the fact that the most celebrated comedic mockumentary in rock history chose the Marshall stack as its central visual reference was not an accident and was not an insult. You cannot build a joke around something that is not real. The Marshall wall was real enough to carry the weight of parody, which meant it was real enough to carry the weight of everything. In 1984, a production designer working on a major studio film needed objects to dress the interior of a spaceship. Among the components chosen was a modified amplifier housing a Marshall cabinet stripped of its electronics and repurposed as a set element. It appeared on screen for less than 4 seconds. Almost no viewer identified it consciously. But it was there, embedded in the visual grammar of science fiction, because the aesthetic logic of what Marshall had built in Milton Keynes had traveled so far from its origin that it was now shaping the imagined future. That is not a product. That is a language. Pete Townshend said it in an interview in 1975 that was printed in 3 continents. He said that when he stood in front of a Marshall stack, he was not standing in front of an amplifier. He was standing in front of an argument that what he was about to do mattered enough to be heard at the back of any room on earth. Jimi Hendrix never gave an interview about Marshall amplification. He did not need to. The photograph from Monterey in 1967-3, stacked cabinets behind him, guitar burning at the end of a performance that remains more than 50 years later. One of the most discussed moments in the history of live music said everything that any interview could have said and said it without a single word. Jim Marshall watched all of this from Milton Keynes. He watched his name travel to places he had never been, attach itself to moments he had never witnessed, acquire meanings he had never assigned to it. He was proud. He was also, in a way, he did not always articulate, aware of something that pride can obscure. The name was now larger than the factory. The symbol was now more powerful than the object. And when a symbol outgrows the thing that created it, it begins to attract a different kind of interest. Not from musicians who need the sound. From people who understand that a name that means something to that many people in that many countries is not just a brand. It is an asset. In 1987, the first serious acquisition approach was made. Jim Marshall declined it. He declined the way a man declines something he has already decided is not a real option, without extended deliberation, without a counteroffer, without leaving any room for the conversation to continue. He was asked how much it would take. He said that was not the question he was prepared to answer. In 1989, a second approach came from a different direction, with a larger number attached to it. He declined again. He believed, and he said this in those words, to the people around him, that the moment ownership separated from understanding, the thing being owned would begin to die. He had watched it happen to other companies. He had no intention of watching it happen to his. What he could not arrange was for that belief to survive him. And the people who wanted the name were patient. They could wait. Chapter 8. The Rise of Good Enough. Over Greatness. The numbers in 1990 were not a warning. They looked like a reward. 350 workers, 4,000 cabinets a week, export markets across 47 countries, a Queen's Award for Enterprise, sitting in the front office of a building that Jim Marshall had expanded 6 years earlier with the full public commitment that it would stand and produce and employ for as long as the name above the door meant anything. The revenue was real. The workforce was real. The cultural dominance was real. No competitor had come close to displacing the Marshall name from its position at the center of professional music performance. No alternative had emerged that professional musicians with serious requirements were choosing over the product built in Milton Keynes. The standard that Jim Marshall had established in a back room in Hanwell in 1962 had held for nearly 30 years, through expansion and growth and the kind of global recognition that most companies spend their entire existence chasing without reaching. From inside the building, there was no visible cliff. From outside it, in a research laboratory in California, the cliff was already being constructed. A company called Digitech had been working since the mid-1980s on digital signal processing technology that could approximate the tonal characteristics of tube amplification. The approximation in 1985 was poor. In 1987, it was better. In 1989, it was something that a working musician in a rehearsal room, under normal conditions, with a normal band mix surrounding the sound, might not immediately identify as wrong. That was enough. Not to replace Marshall, not to compete with Marshall in any arena that professional musicians who cared deeply about tone would recognize as legitimate. But to raise a question, a quiet, dangerous two-word question that had never been raised before in the history of amplified music. Close enough. Jim Marshall did not believe in close enough. He had built his entire life around the rejection of close enough. Every unit that left the testing room in Milton Keynes had to be right. Not approximately right, not right under most conditions, not right compared to what was available at a lower price point. Right. The standard was not adjustable, but the standard only applied inside the building, outside the building. In rehearsal rooms and home studios and mid-size venues across the United States and Europe, the question was beginning to be asked by people who had never been inside a recording studio with a professional guitarist, who had never stood close enough to a Marshall stack to feel the physical pressure of what it produced at full volume. People who knew what a Marshall was supposed to sound like from recordings, from memory, from a reference that was already one step removed from the real thing. For those people, close enough was not a compromise. It was a solution. Digital modeling units from Digitech and a small number of competitors began appearing in American music stores in 1990 and 1991. They retailed at a fraction of the price of a Marshall amplifier. They weighed less than a carry-on bag. They could produce 17 different amplifier simulations in a single unit the size of a practice amp. One of those simulations was marketed explicitly as a Marshall-style tone. It was not the same. Every working musician who played through the early digital units and had also played through a real Marshall stack could identify the gap immediately. The digital units were flat where the Marshall breathed. They were consistent where the Marshall responded. They were the same every time in a way that the real thing never was, and that sameness, which the digital manufacturers marketed as a feature, was precisely the quality that made the simulation feel like a photograph of a place rather than the place itself. But Jim Marshall and the people around him made a mistake that confident organizations make when they have been right for a very long time. They believed that being right was enough. They saw the digital units entering the market. They discussed them in meetings. They analyzed the sales data coming from American distributors. They looked at the numbers and determined that the professional market, the market that mattered, the market that had built the name, was not moving. They were correct about the professional market. They were wrong about everything else. Because the professional market was not where the volume was. The volume was in the middle, in the hundreds of thousands of musicians who played seriously, but not professionally, who practiced at home and performed at local venues and recorded in home studios, and did not need the sound that Jim Marshall had spent his life perfecting. They needed a sound that was good enough to feel right in their context. And good enough was getting better every 18 months. By 1994, the internal conversations at Marshall had shifted in tone. The language was still confident. The revenue numbers still supported confidence. But the questions being asked in the meeting rooms were different from the questions being asked 5 years earlier. They were more defensive, more reactive. more focused on what was happening outside the building than on what was being built inside it. Jim Marshall was 71 years old. He was still walking the floor. But the floor was about to change in ways that no amount of walking could prevent. Chapter 9. The slow drift that changed everything. The market did not crash, it drifted. That was the thing that made it so difficult to respond to, and so devastating when the full weight of it became clear. A crash produces urgency. A crash forces a decision. A drift produces arguments about whether the movement is real, whether it will reverse, whether the data being read is the right data, or a temporary signal that will correct itself in the next quarter. Marshall drifted into the second half of the 1990s arguing about the data. By 1996, digital modeling amplification was no longer a curiosity in American music retail. It was a category. Line 6, a small California company, had released the pod, a kidney-shaped unit roughly the size of a hardback book that could produce convincing simulations of 21 different amplifier tones. It retailed for $300. It weighed less than 2 pounds. It required no speaker cabinet. It could be plugged directly into a recording interface and produce a track that, in a finished mix, a non-specialist listener could not reliably distinguish from a track recorded through a real amplifier in a real room. $300. A comparable Marshall stack head and cabinet, built in Milton Keynes to the standard that Jim Marshall had held since 1962, retailed for more than 10 times that amount. The Line 6 pod did not sound like a Marshall. Every guitarist who had spent real time with a real Marshall stack understood this immediately and completely. The digital unit was flat where the Marshall moved. It was static where the Marshall breathed. The harmonic complexity that emerged from tubes pushed to the edge of their capacity. The thing Pete Townshend had called honest distortion, the thing Jimi Hendrix had used to invent a new vocabulary of sound, could not be fully captured by a digital processor in 1996. But the guitarist community was not one thing. It was a population with a distribution. At one end were the professionals, the touring musicians, the studio players, the artists whose entire identity was built around tone and who could hear the difference between a Marshall and a simulation, the way a sommelier hears the difference between a 20-year bottle and a 10-year bottle of the same wine. That end of the distribution was not moving. They were not buying Line 6 units. They were not interested in close enough. At the other end were the beginners' students, hobbyists, people who had just picked up a guitar and needed something to practice through. That market had never been Marshall's core. They had always bought cheaper alternatives. The dangerous ground was the middle, the serious amateurs, the weekend musicians, the people who had been playing for 10 years, who understood tone well enough to know they wanted something specific, but not well enough to hear every gap in a digital simulation. Those people were looking at a $300 unit and a $3,000 unit and asking the question that the market had never asked so loudly before. Is the difference worth it? For a growing number of them, the answer was no. The forum conversations in 1997 and 1998 documented the shift in real time. Players who had saved for a Marshall and bought one were defending the purchase with increasing intensity, which meant they were aware it needed defending. Players who had bought a Line 6 unit were not apologizing. They were asking why the conversation about tone purity mattered to someone who recorded at home and performed at venues with 300 seats. It was a reasonable question. Marshall did not have a reasonable answer, not because the answer did not exist, the answer was in the sound itself, in the physical reality of what a tube amplifier built to Jim Marshall's standard produced in a room. But the answer required the listener to be present in that room, and fewer people were making the trip. The company released responses, new product lines aimed at lower price points. Limited edition reissues marketed to the professional community. Heritage campaigns built around the cultural history that Hendrix and Townshend and the photographs from Monterey and the Spinal Tap wall had accumulated over 3 decades. The campaigns were well executed. They were also solving the wrong problem. The problem was not that people had forgotten what Marshall meant. The problem was that what Marshall meant was no longer sufficient justification for a large and growing portion of the market for the price at which Marshall sold. Jim Marshall understood the difference between a product problem and a perception problem. He had built his entire career on the conviction that substance preceded image, that if the thing was right, the recognition would follow. He had been correct about that for 30 years. But the market had changed the question. It was no longer asking whether the Marshall sound was real. It was asking whether the Marshall sound was necessary. And Jim Marshall, at 75 years old, walking a floor that was producing fewer units than it had a decade earlier, did not have a mechanism to answer that question at scale. The offers began arriving again. This time, the numbers were different. This time, the people around Jim Marshall began to listen in ways they had not listened before. And Jim Marshall, who had refused every approach for 30 years on the grounds that ownership separated from understanding produces only one outcome, was running out of the one thing that had always made his refusal possible. Time. Chapter 10. When Ownership Kills the Soul of Creation. Jim Marshall died on April 5, 2012. He was 88 years old. He had spent more than 50 years building a name that meant something specific, not as a brand position, not as a marketing concept, but as a physical reality that could be tested by plugging a guitar into a machine built in Milton Keynes and listening to what came out. He had refused acquisition after acquisition on the grounds that the name and the standard that created it could not be separated without destroying the thing that made the name worth anything. He was right about that. He was gone 14 months when the full weight of the ownership structure that had been assembling around the company since the early 2000s became undeniable in its consequences. The number attached to the deal was $500 million. $500 million. Not the revenue. Not the lifetime output. Not the value of 350 workers and 40 years of accumulated craft knowledge and a testing standard that no digital processor had fully replicated. The sale price of the name. The price that the market had determined the word Marshall was worth detached from the factory, detached from the floor, detached from the sound of Baltic birch being cut in a wood mill in Milton Keynes on a Monday morning. The acquiring entity was Sound Industries, a Swedish consumer electronics company whose primary business was the production of headphones and portable speakers marketed under licensed brand names. They understood distribution, they understood retail positioning, they understood the mathematics of brand equity in consumer electronics markets. They did not walk the production floor in Milton Keynes the way Jim Marshall walked it. They did not need to. That was not the business they were in. The press release used the word partnership. It used the words heritage and integrity. It used the language that acquisition announcements always use, the language of continuity, of respect for what came before, of a future built on the foundation of the past. The words were not false. They described intentions that were, in the moment of their expression, genuine. But intentions are not structures, and the structure of what had been purchased did not align with the structure of what had built it. The new ownership was incentivized differently. Their return on a $500 million investment required scale, required efficiency, required the kind of decision-making that views a hand-wiring section staffed by workers who have spent 11 years developing tolerances in their fingers as a cost rather than a standard. Required the movement of production to facilities where the unit cost of assembly was lower and the output per labor hour was higher. These are not evil decisions. They are the correct decisions for the objectives they serve. The problem was that the objectives did not include the thing that Jim Marshall had spent his life protecting. The workforce numbers tell the story without requiring editorial. At peak, 350 people worked the Milton Keynes floor. Through successive restructuring cycles following the acquisition, that number fell. Production of specific product lines was moved. Component specifications were reviewed against cost targets and revised. Supplier relationships that had been built around quality standards were renegotiated around price points. Each individual decision, reviewed in isolation, was defensible on a spreadsheet. Together, they produced a factory that was no longer the factory that Barbara Travers had wired chassis in for 11 years. No longer the factory that Robert Elias had given 19 years of his working life to. No longer the factory where a technician plugged a guitar into every completed unit and listened for the sound that Jim Marshall had carried in his head since 1962. Robert Elias received his redundancy notice in the second round of workforce reductions. He was 51 years old. He had 19 years at Marshall, a house 15 minutes from the facility, and a Saturday morning football routine that a steady Friday paycheck had supported for 2 decades. He took a position at a distribution warehouse outside town. The pay was lower. The work was different in a way that he struggled to articulate to his wife on the evening he came home with the offer letter. He told a local newspaper, in the only interview he gave, that he did not consider himself bitter. He said he understood that businesses change. He said he just wished someone had fought harder to keep the thing real. The revenue composition shifted in the years following the acquisition in a direction that Jim Marshall had spent 30 years of refused offers trying to prevent. The proportion of income derived from manufacturing from the physical act of building amplifiers in Milton Keynes to the standard that Ken Brann and Dudley Craven and Jim Marshall had established in a back room in Hanwell in 1962 declined. The proportion derived from licensing the Marshall name to consumer electronics products that produced no amplified guitar signal at all, headphones, portable Bluetooth speakers, branded apparel grew. The name that Jimi Hendrix had chosen because it was the only machine that could keep up with what he was doing was now attached to products that Jimi Hendrix would not have recognized as part of the same conversation. The original amplifier unit number 1, built in the back room on Uxbridge Road. The machine that a guitarist had played one chord through and asked to play again sits behind glass in the entrance hall of the Milton Keynes facility, silent, pristine. Maintained at a temperature that prevents deterioration, a few feet from where it rests. A production line assembles consumer electronics at a rate that the Milton Keynes woodmill, at full capacity, could never have matched. The contrast is not decorated. It is not staged for effect. It is simply what the building contains now, the origin and the outcome, separated by a few feet of floor and 40 years of decisions. Jim Marshall said it himself, more than once, to more than one person, in more than one context. The moment ownership separates from understanding, the thing being owned begins to die. He spent 50 years making sure that did not happen. He could not make sure of it forever. They did not lose the sound. They replaced it. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that the things built with real hands and real standards are always worth protecting, then share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss the next story. There are more stories like this one coming. Stories of what was built, what was lost, and what the people who built it deserved. Drop a comment below and tell us, what company do you think deserves this same investigation? Your answer might be the next documentary we make. And if someone you know needs to hear a story about what real craft looks like before it is gone, send this to them today.